Gul, thank you so much for speaking with the CSR Journal. First, I'd like to know, on an individual level, you are involved in a lot of activities in CSR and philanthropy. Can you tell me a little about that?
I founded the Colonel Shamsher Singh Foundation a couple years ago, in fact 7 years ago, when I, on a visit to my village in Punjab, was astounded to find that the district to where I belong, where my village is, had the lowest sex ratio as per the 2001 census. And it sort of shocked me to the core that just by accident of birth, I was where I was with all the opportunities that I had access to. And if I was born in a different home in the same village, maybe I wouldn't have had that opportunity. And the idea behind setting up Colonel Shamsher Singh Foundation, named after my grandfather, was A, to continue the work that he'd started. In his lifetime, he contributed immensely in the area, and B, to try and do my bit in bridging the gap. The extent of socio-economic inequity in India is so massive that the most well-intending government cannot bridge the gap. The gap needs to be bridged by private initiative, by private actions, and help existing government initiatives in trying to make it a more equitable society. Now, whether it's gender, everybody can pick a particular cause. There are so many causes. In fact, someone once said, if a million causes had a million supporters, all our problems would be solved. So essentially, I fundamentally believe public-private partnership in philanthropy is very, very important. One, because the government blueprints exist for everything. What sometimes they lack is either manpower or maybe enthusiasm. And I think that's where NGOs can come in and augment the work that's already being done by the government sector.
You've emphasized a lot of importance on all the three stakeholders coming together. How far do you see the 2% mandate, which was there 2 years back, has contributed to that, and how far do you see that going?
I think it's a step in the right direction. To reiterate the point I was making earlier, the gap is so wide. It simply cannot be met, even if the government decides to do all in its power. To do it. So private affirmative action is the way forward to bridge that gap. It doesn't mean that the government should abdicate its responsibility and role, and we hope they won't do that. But it does mean that that the idea of an inclusive state means that we do all our efforts together to bridge the very gap. I mean, the concept of a laissez-faire state is over. It's every state is by default a welfare state. Absolutely. And if 60% of your population doesn't have equitable access to education, healthcare, by default you are a welfare state. Correct. But public-private partnerships, I think in time to come, particularly through 2%, the CSR mandate, will probably begin to yield results in time to come, because the figure is such that by the time, I'm not saying it's a lot, I'm not saying it's less. All I'm saying is for it to actually translate into action that can be verified and mapped.
Correct.
And it will take time. Whereas government schemes are easier to map, because there is a whole system in place which plans and then evaluates, and you find that so many schemes have funds that have remained unspent, and then there is great work that's been done under various schemes as well. But I do feel it's a step in the right direction. Giving companies the mandate legislatively to intervene and do their bit is very, very important.
As actors, the fraternity needs to come forward. Of course, there are very few who are there. There are some who have done eminent work also, and they're speaking on stage today. Do you think the people in power and in the public eye, in terms of the Bollywood team, needs to come forward, more of them, because a lot of people are influenced by them. It's a folly in the country. So do you think more of them need to come forward?
I think social responsibility is a choice. It isn't unfortunately a mandate that you can expect people to fulfill. Ideally, anybody who has the power to influence people, whether they're a cricket star or a hockey star, kabaddi, wrestling, gymnastics, should in their personal capacity to do whatever they can do as role models, influence people. But having said that, I think it's perhaps a tad unfair to expect that they must do so.
All right.
Ultimately, they've become famous pursuing something which was their personal goal, and if that's made them famous, it's not fair to burden them with the social responsibility that we feel comes with it.
Okay.
It may or may not come with it. I mean, it's a perspective. There are some people doing stellar work in this arena. I mean, of course, Rahul Bose has a fantastic foundation called the Foundation, that regularly works with children who don't have access to the same opportunity as the ones in privileged homes do. So I believe there will always be some people who will stand out. To expect everybody to do the same amount is unfair.
Okay. You've been involved in the political arena also. How do you see that coming about and taking this social responsibility? Because very recently we've started talking and giving outside our family. Others is mostly had it as hereditary philanthropy. How do you see that narrative changing?
I think a natural extension of any kind of activism is eventually political, because not to take away from those who do activism apolitically, but if you really want to be able to bulldoze your way through, and sometimes you have to, when you look at the state that I come from, Punjab, and the massive statistics of even today female feticide, which means sex determination is happening.
Absolutely.
And the only power that has the power to check that is the state. Only the state is empowered to use coercive strength to fulfill its agenda. So no matter what ultimately you may do apolitically and as an activist, ultimately that power to aggressively legislate and check comes politically, and of course from being in government. So I think there is no doubt that the governments across the country, both state and center, are doing stellar work. The quantum of work that needs to be done is so much that one isn't able to perceive any change. And that's the irony of India. A country of 1.35 billion people with so much that needs to be done. And I'd like to take this opportunity to say that a lot is being done across political spectrums, across state governments, even the central government. And every government does its share of work. Some governments go above and beyond the call of duty. Some individual representatives, whether they are MLAs or MPs, they go above and beyond the call of duty. But suffice to say that there is so much that needs to be done, that it's so much easier to see the glass half empty in India. And we're a long way away from when it's going to begin to look close to full. How do you galvanize people to fill the gap? I mean, eventually it comes back to how do you bridge that gap? Because the quantum of that the chasm that exists between what people should have and what they have is so vast that unless and until affirmative action comes in, and unless and until there is social enterprise, for example, a lot of young people today are choosing to set up their own concerns rather than going and working for MNCs.
Correct.
Because what you do therefore is you also generate employment apart from generating personal wealth, which is it's
huge numbers.
It's, and I think it's important to make sure that you don't castigate somebody for wanting to generate personal wealth.
Correct.
If they can do that and fulfill a bigger aim through social enterprises, why not?
Absolutely.
And I think a lot of that is going to happen. I see in the coming decades a lot of affirmative action coming out of the private sector. I see that coming out of homes, as you'd said. There is a sense of responsibility, and to be fair, the sense of responsibility has always been there. Families traditionally have always taken care of people who worked with them.
Correct.
We didn't see it as philanthropy, but if you look at it through a Western prism or through the Western magnifying glass, you would say that every Indian is by default a philanthropist, because every Indian is helping somebody who works with them, for them, around them.
Correct.
So we do have philanthropy in our
DNA.
in our DNA. We do, because it's whether it's in our culture, whether you can take it to our religious text. There's ample evidence of people wanting to help people around them. Sometimes it's in the microcosm and you're unable to see it in the bigger picture. And I think legislative action will always result in bigger and larger impact. And I hope to see that impact in the coming decades, but it will take decades for the impact to show.
One aspect of what you said is the demographic of India is not only the number, it's the quality that's been churned out. How do you see internationally also they practice creating sharing value concept? How do you see that to be implemented in our country where we just have the give and take relationship?
I think fundamentally, the focus on public education needs to be heightened. Public spending in education and healthcare should be the two blocks on which a society is built. We cannot abdicate our responsibility towards educating those who can't afford quality education. In an ideal space, a public school should be able to give the same quality of education as a private school. I know that's a lofty ideal. But having said that, unless and until that education system is looked at aggressively,
Okay.
you cannot expect value systems to be formed. There is, I wasn't there in the 60s, but people talk about how the value system that was inculcated in younger generations back in the 60s and 70s was better. Of course, every generation will look back and say, "Oh, our generation was better." But the focus of values is cannot be overstated. It comes from good education. If we are unable to instill in our children up till the ages of 10 and 11 that it's important to live in society where there is sharing, where there is symbiotic relationship, where it's not about me first.
Correct.
Unless and until we inculcate those values through schooling, which ultimately is a function of how governments consistently spend and where their focus lie. I think primary education and secondary education needs a massive, massive, massive boost.
Okay. Ma'am, could you tell me very briefly what is CSR to you? My last question.
Corporate social responsibility is what the acronym stands for. I think it's important for corporates to share not just their wealth, which they do through this 2% rule now, but to also share their expertise. Because very often it's not just about money. While very many times it is about money. But sometimes it's about expertise. Digital concerns can create opportunities to bridge gaps digitally. Schools may not be able to reach the last mile in far off places, but network has reached, and through network you can make sure that education can reach them, because ultimately it keeps coming back to education, keeps coming back to education. There cannot be enough investment, private or public, in education in India, given how wide the gap is. So sometimes technology can actually bridge the gap much quicker than actually physically bridging the gap. So quality education is one place where I feel CSR can really deliver a lot, especially those corporates who have a digital end. And today, every corporate needs to have a massive digital backbone.
It's been absolutely lovely and insightful talking to you. Thank you so much for your time, ma'am.
Thank you for your really interesting, insightful questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.